Hey folks, thanks for joining us today. Today we've got a really special guest, close friend of mine, and a amazing TouchDesigner developer, Lucas Morgan. Thanks for joining us, my friend.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. And for folks that aren't familiar with you and Enviral Design and kind of your work, do you want to tell folks about yourself?
Sure. Enviral Design is just kind of the name I go by for my projects and my pseudo business stuff. And, it started off over 7 years ago because I came from the 3D industry. I was doing a lot of non-real-time 3D work. And I think a lot of people have heard this story or have the story themselves. I saw Amon Tobin's show, ISAM, and I just like, what is this? I see ambient occlusion. I see all these rendered elements, but it's happening in real time. It's exciting. I'm not waiting 3 hours to see a frame. So I looked it up, found TouchDesigner, and from that point onwards, I was like, what can I build with this cool thing? And so I just started working it into my free time, and self-taught programmer in terms of like Python and stuff. That's something I also had a little experience with in the 3D world because Maya and many other softwares now, Blender 2, use Python in the back end. So that was already kind of happening. And then, TouchDesigner just grew and grew. I started fiddling with pixels. One thing led to another. GeoPix was eventually born, not in name, but name eventually later. And then that iterated over years and years. And here we are. So...
And that's what we're going to talk about today is GeoPix, because GeoPix for a while is the go-to tool that a lot of pros were talking about. I need to do a really complex LED mapping, or I've got to do kind of this really custom LED mapping. LED mapping is kind of the ballpark of GeoPix, and it's what it's really strong at. And recently you've decided to go open source with it so that everybody can kind of use it not only for free but also dig into what's behind it. Can you tell folks a little bit about GeoPix as well?
Yeah, GeoPix is a pixel mapping software. It's also a visualization software and a lighting control software. My goal originally, I didn't think about anything beyond those silly RGB WS28, 2811 pixels. And that's what it started with, but things kind of evolved and I started adding in the ability to handle other things like DMX fixtures and video services. The big challenge with GeoPix when I started adopting things that were not strictly RGB was, how do you handle different types of channels and different numbers of channels, totally arbitrary user-created channels, and do that quickly and fast, right? And so doing that was a difficult process. Coming up with the right workflow was, multiple years of just trial and error, but the GPU played a huge part in that, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that here in a bit. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to think about also because, like when you were starting out with GeoPix, 2811's RGB, that's what everybody was using. But now, every time somebody tells me about an installation they're doing is a brand new LED pixel somebody created with a completely different channel mapping. And, it seems like it is so many variables to manage that it's pretty incredible that, you've been able to make this tool. And I think as people are going to see in a moment, like, this is probably, I think, one of the best examples of a really polished application, I would say, made in TouchDesigner, right? It's not very common for folks to make full-blown applications inside of TouchDesigner.
Yeah, there's a lot of overhead that comes with building out the rest of an application. A lot of that I didn't see coming either until I got into it and started developing. But that's a big part of it. Is making it something that people can use from the front end. That's just something I've found interesting. Even back before I knew TouchDesigner, I was building these scripts that I would use for myself. Other people in the 3D team didn't know how to use those scripts, right? They're not going to just copy paste them into their editor and run them. So having little UIs, packaging it up nicely, something I always found interesting. So that was just something I wanted to do here as well.
Great. So I think something that would be really cool is first we're going to take a look at GeoPix and you're going to give us the kind of tour of what somebody might experience the first time they're getting up and running with it. And then we'll talk about some really cool techniques that you used behind the scenes. So let me transition here over to our screen share. And we're live. So if you want to take us through something that might be like a common usage of GeoPix for folks.
Yeah, I recently put together a tutorial that takes people through, I'm calling it this new series, Barebone Tutorials, where it's really just like, I don't want to know all this extra fluff. I just want to get in there and accomplish a specific task and at least have something I can play around with. So That's how I am. When I Google stuff, I just want to like say, okay, what's the fastest way to get from 0 to this specific thing, just so I can see if it works for my needs. So
do you do the thing that I do where when you web search a problem, you get the Stack Overflow link. You don't actually read the question or the answer, but you go down to the first check mark, you see code, and you're like, I pray if I copy and paste this, so like my problems go away, right? Like let's give it a try.
And then if that doesn't work, you scroll down 2 more answers, and the one that doesn't have a check mark by it is sometimes better than the one that does.
Yeah, accurate. And then if all of those fails, then you start reading like, oh, what was the actual question? Like, what are the explanations? Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, totally. Stack Overflow has been a game changer, even for TouchDesigner. So, so when you start GeoPix, kind of a blank scene. A lot of my inspiration for this came from Blender and Maya and other 3D apps, and so that a lot of stuff kind of is inspired by that. But anyways, you can create different object types. The one I'll make now is a fixture, because most people just want to get in here and do pixel stuff. And when it comes in, there's nothing here. It's just an empty fixture. So fixtures have 2 different, they're special in the sense that they have 2 sub-object modes. Most objects are just an object, and you can adjust the parameters like translate, rotate, scale. But fixtures have, them and one other, they have hull and pix modes. So you can go in here and you can create these things called hulls. Fun fact, these were actually, I don't know if other softwares use hulls, but Maya uses them for splines. That was a name, and that's actually where I kind of borrowed that name. It's kind of a strange name, but it came from somewhere. Control points would be another word, but yeah, you can call it whatever you want. But control points essentially, or hulls, are basically these orange dots, and you can just place them in various places. You can select those hulls and create a generator from that selection. And what that does is it's like a macro. It essentially does a few steps, but it exits hull mode and then attaches a generator to that fixture, and then it kind of configures it with what it thinks your selection means. So in this case, I had 4 hulls. It's like, okay, you may want to do a strip. So it kind of configures things. I can type in maybe a larger number, not that large, 150. And then we have, you can see here as I select it, it's just a line of pixels. Maybe this is a door frame, right? Something like that.
And all of that was really you just essentially dropping in those hull points and then saying, hey, this is a strip with 150 pixels. Yeah,
and something I should mention too is if you're working off of geometry, which is I think most people's workflow, you can actually go in here and draw directly on the vertices.
Oh, that's cool.
So you can snap things to like guide geometry, which is a great way to work if you have that kind of thing, but you don't have to work that way. Cool thing about generators too is they're dynamic, so they kind of update constantly. So you can work in a way that you're drawing out a strip, and then it's always going to follow and kind of recalculate. So that's useful as well.
And this looks like it's running really smoothly, which I think we're going to talk about some GPU stuff.
Yeah.
But that's really awesome.
So much development goes into making it run smoothly, even for the simple things, but scalability too. There's still things I'd like to improve, but I'll get into that here maybe in a bit. But so door frame. Next thing you might want to do if you're doing something very simple is just create like a projector. Projectors are actually a very important piece if you're doing internal content inside of GeoPix and you want to kind of build things. Projector is basically how you get 2-dimensional content, whether it be generative or a VJ loop, into the 3D world. Like it's the kind of conduit, I guess, through which that stuff flows.
Yeah.
If you've ever done, work with UVs and 3D software, this is basically the same concept. But anyways, projector comes in. You can test it just by giving it a constant color. So you can see RGB works just fine. And then if we hop over into the IO tab, which this is, for those of you who know TouchDesigner, which is probably many, going to look very familiar. Nodes, you can make things like macros, and then you can go inside these macros, which are essentially just containers. And you have, things like ramps. You can make, let's see here, I'll do a noise. And this probably looks familiar too. A straight wrapper for TouchDesigner nodes, which is the beauty of this. Composites. And this is obviously not going to look great, but it's just give you a rough idea. Oops. Composite these two together. Maybe this is difference mode or something. We can also take this ramp. We can edit the ramp and move the
that's a really nice
ramp points. Yeah, this is fun to make, an actual editor. And then I put in a few extra macros here, like randomize the color ramp, find something cool, maybe tweak it a little bit more. But anyways, that's that's the basics here. Of course, nothing's moving, and that's because the macro is not playing. Macros can play as well, and you can set them up later for performance stuff. And the default of 2 seconds just kind of loops continuously. So once that's done, you have the texture out nodes, and you can connect that macro to a projector. So this little list up here is kind of what populates and unpopulates based off of what's in the editor.
Oh, that's cool. I like that.
Yeah, and so then basically you have, doesn't look very great, but you have a texture being projected. Let me actually take this, as much as showing off the composite is cool, I think it'll be a little bit more meaningful visually just to see a ramp. Yeah, so you can kind of see you just have that ramp being projected right over top of that. So what's cool about the projectors is, let me make another quick fixture that's set up as an array. I see like a screen.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Whoops. So here's just a 32 by 32 array. I'll scoot this up and move it over. One thing I've got right now an issue with is the overlap, because my fixtures are kind of taking up the same address space. So I'm just going to fix that real quick. But yeah, so you got these projectors, and the projectors are not meant to be animated. They're really meant to be like a static portal, right? I guess to kind of get your content onto it. You can have lots of projectors. You can have one that's covering everything. You can have one that's just targeting specific fixtures. You can have masks that are applied through fixtures. You can rotate these, and you can get some really interesting content effects just by skewing things. You can go into perspective mode, which is a lot more interesting with an array. So if I take this scale and just go down to 25, and then I set the
extend like a camera frustum.
Yeah, you can really get some really crazy stuff with just tiling textures.
That's cool.
Using perspective 3D to kind of tile them.
And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things for folks getting into GeoPix is how much more visual the process becomes for all of this kind of LED wrangling and fixture wrangling. Because this is whenever I've had to do it, it's these cryptic shuffling, sequences happening in your brain, and you're like, well, I hope it comes out right. I hope the right thing comes out in the right order. Yeah,
and that's something that you get used to in Touch, but it's nice to not have to think about that, especially when you start working with any other elements. One of the things that inspired other types of fixtures and devices in GeoPix was the just the sheer new. It's just a totally new workflow, right? If you want to work with video, it's just new software, new workflows. And if you're comfortable with working with a video workflow, which GeoPix primarily is, and if you can tie all those things together under one system, you can just kind of work with one ecosystem instead of 3 or 4, and that's the idea. Obviously, there's challenges with that. There's a reason why different workflows exist for those different things, but so that's the basics of creating a basic scene and doing some content. As you can see, this simple ramp is just spinning around in a circle, and it's a totally different look with all that. And the last thing, and this is something that's still pretty much work in progress, is the Perform tab. A lot of people don't use it in their projects, and so it's kind of fallen into the further back area of my own personal development queue. But this is something I'm putting a lot more effort towards now, is the ability to create your own VJ interfaces. So you can make button banks and vertical sliders. And these things are cool because you can actually bring them into your IO graph here. And if I capture a widget capture here, set auto learn to on, and I'll just let's move this vertical slider. And so now I've got it here. I can actually drag it up and down here as well. And maybe I want this ramp to be controlled not by time, but by phase. So, you can actually have this set of controls here, and these things can map with OSC and MIDI and so on and so forth, that you can now have control over in the actual Perform tab as well. So if I create a Viz widget here, we can just see our scene.
So that's pretty interesting, because then, folks coming to this tool could do it both set up in the sense where I have TouchDesigner running in the background and this is kind of running alongside of it. Yeah. But also it has a totally like standalone functionality. Like you could have a bunch of VJ loops, bunch of clips, bunch of stuff you already rendered out of Touch, bring those in as movies, and then kind of create this whole VJ performance application.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that as I developed this software, I came to learn what people were using it for and how they're using it, and a lot of people are really comfortable with their own VJ interfaces, and that's something that people are very like, once they get good at that, and I understand this, it's like it's hard to adapt to a new system for a live thing, right? You don't have time to like ruminate over it and think about it, so you really want something that you can just like, it's like tactile, it. And so yeah, pipe stuff in through every protocol that TouchDesigner supports is obviously OSC and DI. What's the other ones? I know there's Spout. A bunch, but
yeah. I think Spout's in there. I've seen Spout in there.
Spout. Yeah. So all that stuff is important to have too. And then for the people who want to create like a very simple VJ interface, they can do that here, and they can get more complex with it. They can time code stuff to the timeline down here. We have a keyframe editor too, so you can actually grab. So if you wanted to. If you had a performance where that projector had to move, maybe something's on a winch on a stage and it just needs to go up and down in a certain part, and you can go in here and you can keyframe various values, and maybe I'll move this up a little bit again. And so you can keyframe stuff. You can also drive it with OSC. There's an expression editor. I won't get into that right now because that's something I haven't looked at in a while. It might be broken, but there's a lot of stuff going on there. But the idea is to like give people a simple path, and then an intermediate path if they need it, and then an advanced path if they really want to. But to not hopefully make the simple path more convoluted without it being needed to. So yeah.
And that's really amazing, because we could sit here and talk about the features all day. And I think for folks, when we get to the end of this video, Lucas will tell us where you can grab GeoPix, how you can learn more about it and get into the features. Something I thought that would be really interesting is, because you spend so much time really building out a fully featured tool, talking about maybe one of the interesting techniques you used while building that tool. And I think you had mentioned kind of like GPU optimization, and how you're using the GPU in a lot of these workflows was kind of an interesting behind the scenes look we could take at it.
Yeah, absolutely. To recap, one of the things that was a priority and also a challenge in GeoPix was making it to where, you're not just dealing with pixels, you're dealing with pixels generically or abstractly, meaning if you have an RGB pixel, that's fine, but maybe it's BGR, or maybe it's RGBW, or maybe you have a DMX light with 15 channels and some of those are RGB. Maybe it's a color wheel, maybe it's a dimmer. All these things are wildly different beasts in most applications that you see, but creating a system that could kind of work with these cohesively and as one type of data, even though the data is always going to be laid out differently, was an important thing to get right, and a challenge, probably the biggest challenge. And doing that efficiently, right? Building software that people can scale. I created this grid and a strip, right? And I can't say at this point that this performs well, because I have no idea what other people are going to do. And people have pushed this thing so far, farther than I ever thought, within like months of it being released, at least 1.0. And so, optimizing things for the GPU is something that I constantly come back to. And
just in case people didn't believe, this is TouchDesigner.
Yes, this is very much
everything they saw, the node-based editing, the keyframe animation, the timelines, this is all in TouchDesigner, folks. I think that's what's really incredible.
Yeah, it's been a process. I have some design principles. I say principles. There were things I did 3-4 years ago that I have adhered to, even though I would do things differently now, just because in a software this big, it's really challenging to go and refactor some of those things. But then other things I've updated. So it really just depends on what part of the network and what it is. A lot of OP shortcuts in here. No use of internal parameters. But anyways, it's an evolving thing. Always is. So the way that the scenes and the projects work in the editor is that you create your objects, and everything's a geocomp, right? Everything is a 3D object. There's lots of great Python functions attached to the geocomp stuff. The matrices, points, vectors, all that stuff is just dead useful. So I decided, everything is why reinvent the wheel, right? TouchDesigner already has this stuff built in. I was writing enough code as it was. So, here's the geocomp scene that represents what you see here. You have fixture 1, generator, and I have it select these things in touch just so that I can debug stuff easily.
That's smart.
Yeah. And so, if I go over here to fixture 2, which is the grid, and I'll just go into this, it's kind of made up of submodules. Inside of here, things are pretty non-descriptive visually. In other places, it's a little bit more so, but you have kind of where the data starts, right? Is here. You have essentially your coordinates, right, being written out to a script chop. And so this is actually, you see 4 sets of coordinates here because you can have up to 4 UV sets or coordinate sets, but for the most part, people don't need that. And this is going through some, chop processing and, your basic chop networks to kind of get it prepared. And then once it gets here, all these red nodes, this is basically the last stop before it goes to the GPU. And this was challenging because at first I was generating the GPU textures inside of each object, and that was very expensive. And before, I was actually generating these huge chops of all of these channels before I merged them. And so the trick was finding, where do I expand that data? Because ultimately, you can write out a little bit of data that represents a fixture, but it does have to be expanded into more data, before it gets to the GPU, because GPU is a parallel creature. It really needs to be laid out differently. So the fixtures exist here, and then using some dat lists that basically keep track of what's in the scene. That stuff gets over here in the sampler engine, kind of gets brought together into one big buffer, and that happens right here, prepare coordinates. So this is where things start to get interesting. It's obviously hard to tell exactly what's going on just by looking at these tops, because these are all very much optimized buffers and they're not visually descriptive in any way. But if I middle mouse click on this, you'll see that we have a 512 wide. That's familiar. It's DMX, DMX land at this point. We have 8 universes. What was that?
I was saying nice. I always like it. For me, it's always a really helpful thing, especially when I'm working on the GPU, because like what you're saying, it's sometimes hard to visualize. And when I start to see the patterns of like, it's 512 pixels, because we have 512 channels in DMX. I'm like, oh, nice. Like, great, right? Like that's awesome, right? Yeah.
And gosh, there's so many times where I wanted to just print a string, just print a number. And like, no, you can't do that. You got to write it out to a texture. And if it's buried 4 functions deep, good luck. I haven't actually tried looking at this as points, but all right, it actually works. So if I use a nifty feature that's in the later versions of Touch to view textures as points, you can kind of see we have the coordinates. There's actually other data embedded in this you can't see. But yeah, this is, see here, it's just one. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that's basically the coordinates. But as you can see, we've got some buffer selects. So we're doing a lot more work in there than just that first pass, but of each coordinate set and some auxiliary data that's associated with each pixel, like what channel number is it, because you can have more than 3 channels. Every channel is associated with like a channel index, right? A global lookup, essentially. So stuff like that. All of that is happening on the GPU? Yes. At this point, it never leaves the GPU again until you either send it to your pixel controller or it doesn't. It just goes to the screen. And that's probably one of the things that makes this like such a fluid feeling, smooth application. So really, essentially, you just do a little bit of setup on the CPU, and then everything else just happens GPU side in one form or another. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, and I'm sure a lot of other people too. When you do stuff with DATs, like say DATs are like the storage system for a network. This is how it used to work a long time ago. And it's a centralized place. It's so easy to keep track of things like undo. But then if you make one change to a cell, it hits everything downstream of that. So that I had to get away from that. And I tried different things, but what I ended up finding out was that if every object is its own object, when you edit that object, it's not affecting the other objects, right? All the heavy cooking is done within that geocomp to a point. And then what comes after that is, essentially just the condensing of information and then expanding it to the right format or layout for, processing. And so getting things in just the right place, because there's these different places where things can happen. That is, it's been a challenge too. But I've only written one or two. Really, it took me a long time. C++ chops, but there was a few things where I just couldn't get away from doing it on the CPU. But I also couldn't do it with Python. It's just too slow, and so there's some of that too. But very, very little. For the most part, it's just it's done the old-fashioned way in Touch, and then through lots of GLSL. And so, anyways, things kind of move out of here. These coordinates are static, right? So if I update a single fixture, any fixture, it's going to update this whole buffer. It's going to redraw it, but it's a GPU script, so it's fairly quick. And then where things kind of hit the real-time land is in here. And actually, they're not right now because, hold on, enable timing. So once they come into the actual sampler, you can see we have our ramp in our IO node. This is actually what's coming out of this texture out node. And, if I had more macros, they would populate here. This is like a fixed, that's another thing is replicators are heavy to like replicate. And something I'm still in the progress of doing is creating up multiple sampler buffers or sampler systems. And most of these will be static. They'll be there, but they won't be in use. And so, using Touch's cook pull system, I'm hoping to basically make it to where if you have 30 or 40 or 50 projectors, it just starts to use more of those resources as it needs them. But if it doesn't, it just lets them sit. So that's what these are. They're here, they're plugged in. As soon as something shows up, it's going to pipe into this slot, but it's not actually going to create that on the fly. Creating and deleting nodes is another one. I've had to get away from very node heavy comps that get deleted and created on the fly and do things like script chops and script tops and things like that just to reduce the node count, because the user experience is when you create or delete something, if it takes 30 seconds every time you do it with a medium to large scene, it gets to be really painful. So,
and I can imagine, because there's also so much data within even just a simple like 32 by 32 array of pixels, right? Like that's really interesting. So you're doing very little creation and destruction of operators throughout the whole process.
As little as possible. Yeah, that scene comp I mentioned or showed earlier where you see the actual things, that's what the user creates and destroys through the viewport. Everything, as much as I can, is either removed from that part of the pipeline, so it's done after the data kind of comes together, or it's just reduced in node count. It's bad practice to not use null chops, but I've been notoriously bad in the geocomp objects to just draw an expression directly from the top parameters. It's like this huge long expression that's this long, and it doesn't matter for me because I don't want that to be readable. I just want it to be so fast to create and delete, and 2 or 3 nodes here and there adds up if they're the right kinds of nodes or the wrong kinds.
Totally right, and it's one of those expressions where everything's good practice till it's time to optimize it.
Yes.
And then good practices go out the window to make it as fast as possible. And it just depends on how much, I always say it's, if anyone needs to look at it, that's the litmus test of how much I'm allowed to optimize something.
Yeah, and I'll fully admit too, there's been places where I've sacrificed readability, even for me, to achieve functionality, at least in the ways that I knew how. So that's just that's part of it, I think, sometimes. But yeah, so the data hits this sampler, and this is honestly the simplest looking thing. I mean, it makes sense, right? You're seeing these individual channels, RGB, 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 kind of flowing and animating, and this is 512 wide, 8 universes tall. And so this is what gets pulled back into the viewport to do things like these pixel previs, but also if you are talking to pixel controllers, this goes straight out through a heavy, unfortunate, top to chop, but there's no way around that. And that goes out to the actual devices. So the advantage of
a lot of that stuff is getting instanced via tops.
So this is being, so there's I'll go ahead and show you a couple places. So it kind of loops back around, right? So you have all this stuff in the scene that's being created, and then you get to the end, and then it gets kind of pushed back to the beginning. It's not a cyclic loop or whatever. It feels like it, but it's not quite, because really it's going into a different geometry object, right? For like the viewport pixels or different things, but it's essentially re-rendering that live data. And I ran into so many issues where in the past where what you were seeing on the screen didn't match what people were seeing in real life. And it was important for those two to have as much parity as possible. So that's why
okay, that must be its own challenge.
Yeah. But, what really helped, and it was a painful development thing, was making sure that everything rendered in the viewport comes from the furthest to the end real world data. So that way, at least it reduces the number of places where things can be amiss. And it's been great since that point. But yeah, so this is the raw data. It goes back to, this is a generic buffer, right? It's not just for pixels. If you had a moving light with pan, tilt, rotate, it would have a pixel someone here that would be associated with each of those channels. And it would just be knowing where to pull that information from based on its addressing. So that's the rundown of kind of like the GPU optimized pipeline. This stuff will feed into lots of different instanced and custom GLSL shaders and sometimes regular shaders that draw different things on screen. But that's probably something that we can say for another time.
So that's awesome. Yeah, I think that's really cool for people to see behind the scenes, because I think if folks are imagining how this tool works behind the scenes, they're probably thinking, you have these template. I would, and I'll say this for myself. This is how I imagined it was, okay, well, I'm going to have a container comp or a base comp. And inside of it is going to be all kinds of tables, all kinds of chops that kind of define every single object. And then to your point, like, maybe I'm replicating those as things get added or deleted. But I could definitely see how this is a much better system for a great user experience, because all those things that we were talking about, like creating and destroying, replication, too many nodes, those are what make it so that every time you hit a button, you got to wait 30 seconds and you're like, did it crash, or is this still good?
Yeah.
So that's really amazing to see kind of how you worked through, and even hearing your thought process. Okay, let me try and minimize so that it's just like a little bit of setup, move into GPU, do all of, the kind of channel routing, sampling, everything basically GPU side, and then kind of bring it back into the visualization while also sending that to the output. I think it's like a really unique and cool workflow.
Yeah. And that's kind of one world. And then there's another, and I swear I won't spend too much time here at all. I just wanted to visually show you is the UI stuff, right? That's a whole different realm of GeoPix. It's enormously expensive in terms of development time. I'm sure everyone knows that. But that's something else that exists. There's this huge container with just these very more traditionally built, window comps where you have tools, and the tools accept arguments and they put changes out into the world. Making those modular has been an interesting process. And this is different, right? I'm not too worried about the costs, because these are like fixed once they're there, and once they've loaded, they're pretty much good to go. And so that's totally different workflow. Doing some stuff with the web rendered tops for the UIs here, but yeah, that's another form of optimization. The UI was very, very heavy because I was actually replicating a container for each of these rows once upon a time, and so I had to get away from that by making sure that all this stuff was being drawn at once, not being drawn separately, and that's the same concept, just being applied to a totally different part of the software. So, yeah,
that's crazy. I think we'll have to do a separate episode for Uber GUI, because I know that one's a super hype tool as well, and everyone's always talking good stuff about it.
Awesome.
So let me switch back here to our side by side. So I can't thank you enough, my friend, for coming on, showing us GeoPix, talking about it, and giving us some of that really cool behind the scenes.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. For folks that do want to hop into GeoPix, get using it, because now that it's free and open source, I'm looking at you folks out there. There's no excuse. So get in and on it. Where can people find GeoPix? Where can they find your work and learn more about you? By all means, feel free to tell folks.
Yeah, so I've got this on the screen share if you would like, but I can also just tell you, if you go to GeoPix, sure. If you head over to geopix.io, this is not much of a site because website development is a whole thing of its own, and I wanted to take a step back from that. Yeah. But there is a link here. This is a very simple site to the Facebook. This is the Enviral Design Facebook, the YouTube place where you find tutorials. This is Instagram, nothing new there that you won't get from the Facebook. There's the GitHub, which is obviously the main thing here to show. This will take you straight to the GeoPix GitHub. If you're installing this, there's a couple ways, and the first tutorial here in the wiki will tell you about those in detail, but I recommend doing the GitHub checkout because you can get updates and it won't disturb your file system that you've built up. But you can also just grab the code here and just download it. So there's Patreon and PayPal if you're super into this and want to help out. And of course, email as well if you want to just shoot me an email. So That's about it.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to put those links down in the description of this video. So with that said, thank you so much for joining us, my friend. Is there any final words you'd like to leave people with?
Keep TouchDesigning. You'll get wherever you want to be eventually.
I think that's a good moral of the story. Keep chipping away and things become more and more unreadable, I think would be a good way to say it.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you in the next one.
All right. Yep.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.